Good evening. My name is Heath Rocha and I oversee special education and student services for the Los Gatos-Saratoga Union High School District. We are so pleased that you have taken the time to join us tonight for what we hope to be enlightening, hopeful, and educational. When anything terrible happens in our country or the world, our schools often respond. When it happens in or around our own schools, district administrators often try to make sense of it all in communicating with students, parents, and staff. While the pain is real for so many of our students and their families, we are here tonight to learn together, to gain answers to some of our students' most pressing questions, and to begin the path toward improved understanding, empathy, and action around racial equality and social justice for all.
The questions being posed tonight were developed with the collective voices of our student groups, our administrators, and tonight's panelists. We are so fortunate to have joining us 4 panelists, each with a breadth of personal and professional expertise on issues of equity and education. This event is being recorded and will be broadcast on the school's media channels early next week. Before we introduce our panelists, let us review how the evening will flow.
After we introduce the panelists, we will ask each to give us a bit more insight into their personal narratives and then rotate through the prepared questions. If you have a question, open the link to Google Doc in the chat window and add your question there. We have a place for student comments and a place for parent comments. We will address questions time permitting.
At the conclusion of the webinar, we will either create a response document to attach to the recording when shared, or consider an additional webinar or forum in the coming weeks.
On with introductions. My co-moderator is Carrie Monarchy, Assistant Principal at Saratoga High School. Our panelists tonight are first Dr. Nancy Dome. Nancy is a renowned speaker and leader on equity in school systems and workplaces with over 20 years in the education field as a child care worker, a teacher, and a professor. She has provided professional development to school districts and educational agencies throughout the United States. Her expertise and experience supports transformative culture change, providing the trainings, tools, and leadership to diverse organizations. Through an innovative approach to learning, Epic Education provides online courses accessible to clients in real time with relevant content. Dr. Dome's approach is to meet clients where they are and to help them reach measurable goals that ultimately change the educational experience and outcomes for all students. Nancy works with several community groups in Sonoma as a group mentor and enjoys supporting local performing arts. Her time to unwind and relax is spent in Montana with friends in the outdoors.
Our next panelist, Kelly Cole, has over 20 years experience as a group facilitator, educator, community advocate, and ceremonialist. As an equity trainer with Epic Education, she supports leaders and staff to increase the cultural competency of their organization. Kelly's work with educational clients focuses on creating and sustaining equitable education opportunities for children of color and other marginalized students. Kelly currently sits on the board of the nonprofit Empowerment for Girls. She also enjoys music making and being out in the land in Joshua Tree, where she resides with her partner and her puppy.
Our next panelist is Rosina Capadia. Rosina has a passion for teaching. With nearly 20 years of experience in education, Rosina has acquired experiences in teaching, learning, and development, training and facilitation, and has served organizations in an educator capacity. By collaborating with educators, parents, and students, Rosina believes we can create an environment that will help every student to live up to their ultimate potential. This means creating a space where every type of learner can be successful and not having our learners conform to a type of space. During her tenure at the SELPA, Rosina worked closely with the California Department of Education to support and monitor districts to ensure their policy and procedures are up to date with the state and federal laws to ensure compliance. Rosina volunteers at the Ismailia Center and has been working to implement anti-bullying campaigns to empower young people to make socially responsible decisions by giving them the appropriate tools. She also is an academic coach for refugee students and supports them with acclimating socially and educationally to their new environment.
Our final panelist is Dr. Donna Harris. Since 2009, Dr. Harris has served as president of Minnehaha Academy, a pre-K-12 Christian school founded by Swedish immigrants in 1913. Previously, Donna served as the assistant superintendent and chief academic officer at Valley Christian Schools in San Jose. Prior to her work in independent schools, Donna taught public schools for 12 years, having earned a bilingual elementary and secondary teaching credential, twice receiving Intel Corporation's prestigious Innovation in Teaching Awards. Donna has frequently presented at conferences on topics such as project-based learning, integration of technology, school governance, strategic planning, and school improvement. She authored a chapter in the book, Building a Better School, called Diversity in the Christian School. Donna has served on the Board of Trustees at North Park University, the Minnesota Independent School Forum, and currently serves as vice chair for the Independent Schools Association of Central States, the Ordway Center of Performing Arts, and Hope Academy, a K-12 Christian independent inner city school. Donna is married to Rick, a Minnesota business owner, and is a proud mother of 5 adult children, one of which works at Saratoga High School, and 5 grandchildren.
At this point, we would like to begin with the questions from our students. Nancy, why don't we start with you? Where did you grow up? What was your experience growing up as it relates to race and representation in your community? What has your experience with the police been like?
All right. Okay, thanks for the question. And so I grew up in West Hollywood in Los Angeles. In fact, when there was footage being shown about the demonstrations going down Fairfax Avenue, that's actually, my high school was right across the street. And when I grew up, I actually thought civil rights worked. I guess that's the best way to put it. I grew up in a microcosm where people that I went to school with from elementary all the way through high school, we knew each other's families, the community supported each other. We knew the difference between who was Korean and who was Japanese. We knew who was Peruvian, who was Mexican. We knew, and those were just things, that was the way it was. So we just thought that it was normal to have very diverse friends and to have multiple languages in your community and to respect and take care of each other. So I felt represented. I didn't feel anything. And I think it was more when I left West Hollywood, which I discovered at 17 when I went to college in Arizona. When I left that microcosm, that I realized that civil rights actually only worked in West Hollywood in that moment. Because when I went to college in Arizona, I quickly understood that the way I grew up was not the norm other places. So my experience, when I think about the police in my community growing up, they knew who we were. They knew our names. They knew the kids. They lived in the community. It was when I went to college, my first year, that I actually was arrested for being in a car with 3 white friends where I was going to school on our way home. And we were all arrested. And charges were dropped later, but they were dropped because it was false arrest, and basically it was harassment. And I was the only person of color, and I was the only one who was held in a jail cell with a bail that was higher than anybody else's for no crime to have been committed. So I think as a young person, I was shocked because I didn't believe it could happen, you know, but I honestly know that that's what started my journey and led me to where I am right now. It was understanding that what I wished I would have done in that moment was, instead of accepting the kind of, you know, they dropped the charges for me not to sue the state for false arrest, rather than accepting that, I wish I wouldn't have done. I wish I would have fought, and I wish I would have pushed back, because what I did was, by not fighting, I allowed the system to do it again to more people. But I was also very young and I didn't know the difference. And so from that point on, you know, it's one of those things that I call it trauma. I believe that I have trauma around law enforcement, but outside of that experience, I have not had another bad experience. But that trauma stays with you. And so and I'm not sure how many experiences I'm going to have before that trauma leaves my body, that paranoia of feeling if I'm getting pulled over for speeding or whatever, that something bad might not happen to me. But I can tell you that my engagement with officers outside of that first one hasn't been negative. But I also have an opinion that a lot of my family members, most of my family members are in law enforcement. And so this idea that I'm in this dissonance of having a lot of respect for law enforcement, but also knowing that they're not doing their jobs. And when I say they, it's a big they. I realize that I'm generalizing. There are plenty of good officers out there. I'm talking about the ones who aren't good, the ones who are abusing power, and the ones who are hurting our kids. That's me.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Rosina, maybe you could go.
Sure. My name is Rosina Kapadia. I actually was born in Pakistan. My parents are Pakistani and Indian. So I actually came to the United States when I was very young, and my parents brought me here so that I could go to school and get an education. And I grew up in a very, in an environment where most of the time I was the only child of color. My very first experience noticing color was when I was in kindergarten, and one of my kindergarten friends, I didn't speak a lot of English because my parents felt that I would learn English at school, so they just taught me all of the native languages that I know at home. And a little girl tried to clean me because she thought my skin was dirty. And so we were by the sink, and she was scrubbing my arm and my hand because she was saying, "You're dirty, you're darker." And so that was my very first experience. I didn't understand it, but now I know. But I remember going home and telling my mom, and you know, having her explain it to me. So I grew up a lot of that, and I grew up in elementary, middle, probably high school, just kind of ashamed of being brown. I got called names. You know, there were a lot of derogatory comments made. After September 11th, things got just a little worse, and it was a little more out there for me, myself, my community, my parents. And so it was a little tougher to do, but once I entered college, I met a lot of people similar to me. I joined the Muslim Student Union. And so it turned out to be very different. My experience with police is not, I feel like I really don't have one. You know, I have never been arrested. I've been pulled over for speeding tickets. I probably deserved them, so I'm not gonna go around and say I didn't. But the experience that I do have with police is that I actually was a special education teacher for many years. And I taught teaching my students to really talk to the police so that it will be there to help them. And then one of my students had an interaction with a police officer, and it wasn't a good one because my student was a nonverbal student with autism, and the police officer didn't have the training to support how to interact with him. And so the situation escalated more so than it should have, I think. And then once I was able to get in there, we were able to figure it out. But that was pretty much my only interaction with police. So my experience, I feel like, is very different. I don't hate or love. I don't think I think that the police are overwhelmed in some aspects, and there needs to be more people, especially with training for special education, for mental health, for all of these other things. So I just feel like my experience is very different with that. But I do think that there is an issue that we do need to discuss, and there's things that are happening, but my perspective of it is just one perspective.
Thank you. Kelly?
Good evening, everyone. So I was raised in a suburb of Detroit, Dearborn, Michigan, and it was a predominantly white town and had a mayor who was one of the largest proponents of segregation in the North. And on the border of Detroit, there were very tense racial tones in the '67 riots. And all of that was in my background because my dad was a police officer. And so he retired on disability when I was in elementary school. So I don't remember a lot of him in that job, and he worked nights. And so it was it wasn't a huge thing on my radar at the time. I do remember though, it was a tight-knit community. There were, all the cops' kids. And there was definitely a sense of, as you got older and you still knew who the cops, there was a sense of you got away with more because you were the cops' kids. And so there really was this taking care of each other in this closed system. And I think for me, growing up in that kind of space on the border with Detroit, when I think about my understanding of race and representation, whiteness is not something that anyone ever named or talked about, but we were inundated with the dangers of Detroit. And so the media, you would see Devil's Night in Detroit and the city on fire. And we were really taught this was a place as white suburban kids that we were supposed to fear, which was the subtle message of you are supposed to fear Black people because that's the only people we saw. And so the history of my town and that kind of indoctrination, for me, I really needed to create some different experiences for myself. And so when I got older, I moved into the city and did social work there and just started to have my own understanding of what was happening and realizing the very limiting messages and very insulated messages that I was receiving in that suburban community. The other thing when I think about race and representation, when I was in junior high and high school, there was a large influx of Middle Eastern families into that area. And now Dearborn has one of the largest Middle Eastern populations outside of the Middle East. And when I was in high school, the Gulf War was happening. And there were so many fights in our cafeteria because when I look back now, it was this moment of you have demographics of a town changing and nobody supporting anyone, especially the kids, to know what to do with that. How there was no cross-cultural connection, there was no dialogue, there was nothing. And so kids are left to fend for themselves in a suburb that has that history of racial segregation and real rejection of difference. And so it really was this kind of tumultuous time in my high school. So I think for me, a lot of my work doing this kind of equity work has been really having to challenge a lot of the messages I received and a lot of the enculturation I had in my upbringing to make sure I am challenging stories that I am receiving about different groups, about myself. And that has been ongoing work for me.
Thank you. Donna.
Good evening, everyone. In my book of life, there have been many experiences that have shaped me. So I was raised in a military family, so we traveled frequently. Depending on the school, I was at times one of few people of color in class. In other settings, I was one of many. During my dad's career, 2 times for 1 year each, my dad was stationed in Thailand, and mom transported all of us to her hometown in the Deep South. where she'd been raised, attending still segregated schools down south. I was teased often because I acted white, whereas in the mostly white schools I attended, I received the message in word and deed that I wasn't white enough. I remember in 5th grade, I was in one of those one of few people of color classes, and my teacher approached me one day and said, you know, wearing red fingernail polish is not something you should do with your skin color. I've been sharing nail polish with my white friends, and I didn't know at the time how to handle that comment, but I do remember how that comment made me feel even to this day. I started my career teaching. I always knew that I wanted to be an educator from a very young age, and I worked in 2 very different public school districts, one where the majority of families were families of color, lower socioeconomic status, non-English speaking. The other school was built right in the middle of a country club in a very affluent neighborhood, but issues of race, privilege, and inequality were prevalent in both schools. And it was painful for me as a teacher, particularly a young teacher, being in the faculty lounge and from the lips of those who were preparing future generations to hear racist comments, and that always stuck with me. I started my day early one morning at one of the schools where I taught, and approached my classroom, and the N-word, B-word were spray painted in large letters on my class. And my colleagues really didn't know what to say. They struggled. But I do remember one of the teachers, the kind gesture of bringing me a beautiful bouquet of flowers to help erase the ugliness that I had experienced. My children have all attended schools where they have been one of few students of color. And yes, they have navigated the long list of race issues as well. I transitioned to Minnehaha Academy in 2009 as the 8th president of that school. I'm the first woman of color, first woman and the first person of color to serve as president at that school. I was warmly welcomed by the school community for the most part, but my appointment was also met with shock and disdain by others. After all, it was the year after this nation had elected its first Black president, and some surmised that my hiring was a move to be politically correct. The level of disdain came in the form of an email to Minnehaha's Director of Alumni Relations. Here's the actual text of the email. Please remove my name as an alumni news representative. I was shocked to see all the photos of the new Black president of Minnehaha Academy, especially the photo of her with all of her family and friends on one of the pages in the latest issue. I cannot support this wonderful institution any longer. The founding fathers of this school would be equally disturbed to see the so-called politically correct direction be taken by the board of directors in this appointment. What a tragedy. I do hope that you gave white Caucasian applicants for the president's position equal consideration. And so many of you may be appalled to hear this in 2009, but sadly, people of color brace for these realities every single day. So that's why in our schools, we must seize the opportunities to shape students who will be change makers. And in that, we must celebrate their inherent honor and dignity. Let students know we care and that they matter and valued. Create a safe place for students to ask hard questions and engage with the tough societal issues as they figure out their place and the contributions we need them to make. And so as I think about police, for me personally, I've not had issues, but I have to close my comments by saying that I am married to a big African-American man. And 2 of my 5 children are African-American sons. And there have been many incidences in their lives where they too have struggled to breathe, as Mr. George Floyd did. And so I pray that students of color in our schools can breathe the deep cleansing breaths of hope, joy, love, and acceptance, and really know that they matter. Thank you.
Okay, Keith.
Yes, thank you. We'll move on to the next student question. What are some
So
examples?
before you do, I know this is a webinar, but thank you so much for sharing all those stories. Those are
Yeah.
personal stories and they're powerful, and I hope that lots of people hear them. So thank you for doing that.
What are
Okay,
some?
sorry, Heath.
That's okay. What are some examples of systemic racism? How can we recognize it? And what can we do to address it?
So I'll jump in and just give a definition. We have heard the term systemic racism used. It's not a new term, but it's in recent weeks, we've heard that term used often. Institutional racism is another term that we use. It's a form of racism expressed in the practice of social and political institutions. It's reflected in disparities regarding wealth, income, criminal justice systems, employment, housing, healthcare. Stokely Carmichael and Charles V. Hamilton are the folks that coined the term systemic racism. And systemic racism, I believe, is even more dangerous because it's not identifiable by an overt statements. It's very subtle, much less overt, and originates in the operation of established and respected forces. One way to think about systemic racism is to think about COVID-19. We're in the middle of a pandemic right now, and Blacks are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. America's history of discrimination creates a greater potential for Blacks to be stricken with COVID. Higher poverty rates, limited healthcare access, higher rates of jobs in service industries where they're less able to work from home, with a subsequent increased exposure to risk. Limited access to housing means they live in more densely populated communities, and Black Americans are far more likely than whites to lack access to emergency medical care and other medical types of medical care. And they are often served in hospitals that are less funded, staffed by practitioners with less experience. And we also sadly know of biases by doctors that are treating patients in Black neighborhoods. I don't know if you heard today, there was a senator by the name of Steve Huffman who in a committee meeting that was designed to declare racism a public health crisis, he asked this question, and he asked it like this. He asked whether the colored population is hit harder by the coronavirus because perhaps Blacks don't wash their hands, wear masks, and practice social distancing as well as other groups. So that's an example of the issues of systemic racism.
You know, Donna, thanks for sharing that, because that was actually, I read that today too. And it was that moment where you're just like, with everything going on, I just can't believe that that's actually said by a representative, somebody that's making decisions about our futures, right? And that they can say that with, and feel very comfortable and clearly say that out loud. And that's part of it. That's when we talk about systemic racism, that's part of it. It's that's the harm it does to everyone. It's this belief that that they're speaking to the choir, that everyone feels this way, that don't we know this about these people, and then also that it's just so inherent that nothing can push against it, like nothing can change it, because we just all accept it. So the second example that we talked about was the access to higher education. And when we think about systemic racism, we think about systems that are in place that enable some people to go further and take away advantages from other. And when we think about Brown versus Board of Education legislation that went through in 1950, 56, 54, 56, 54. That was when we desegregated schools, started to. It didn't actually happen well, but that's when the legislation passed. So we're talking about 66 years. And when we think about the fact that schools are still under out of compliance with that legislation from 66 years ago, and nothing has been done to ensure that they're providing services, equitable services to their populations of color, lets us know how systemic racism exists. We have what we call HBCUs, they're historical Black colleges and universities, and those came into existence because for many, many years, Blacks were not allowed to attend institutions that were considered white institutions. And so we had to have institutions where we could go and learn from each other. And I think that's important to know. A lot of people don't even know what a HBCU is and what it did to actually allow the Black excellence that you do see to exist, because without those and without the education system that we had prior to the desegregation, we would still be undereducated. And I have a hypothesis that I don't know is true, but it's a hypothesis that maybe somebody's interested in proving. But I actually believe for those school-age children, Black children who were able to attend school, because not everybody could prior to desegregation, I actually believe that probably our literacy rates were higher because they were being educated by Black people in their community who had high expectations for them, who expected excellence. And what we see is that because of the belief systems that have been instilled in education around what people of color are able to achieve, we see low expectations for them. We don't question the underrepresentation of Black and brown people in AP and honors courses because we actually don't expect to see them there. That is systemic racism.
Thank you, Nancy. One of the other examples we wanted to offer was a conversation about the war on drugs. And in this example, I feel like it's a good model of how systems are perpetuated by beliefs, which are reinforced by systems, and you create this perpetual cycle. And as Donna said, it's hard to pinpoint where do you intervene, especially when issues of who is inherently criminal and inherently innocent are these beliefs that have been woven into our system really since the formation of this country. And so when we think about the war on drugs, the reality of it is so far removed from the implementation of it. So we know that white people and people of color do drugs at about the same rates. We know that people purchase drugs from people who look like them. So there is not a huge discrepancy in people who are actually using drugs. But there is a huge discrepancy in who is policed, who is profiled, who is stopped, who is searched. And so you get this cycle of, if you have communities of color, you have Black communities profiled, searched, arrested, and that's who you see being arrested, then it seems to reinforce this belief of who is inherently criminal, when actually the same behavior is happening in a white community, but it's not policed that way. And so we saw this historically when you talk about the 70s and 80s, the war on drugs. You see it in crack versus cocaine, which is the same drug. The cocaine was used predominantly in white communities, and crack was introduced into Black communities. And what you saw was that the sentencing was much harsher depending on the form of the drug. And so what that did was it reinforced, again, one community being over-policed and over-prosecuted, and another community receiving leniency through the system. When we see it in this contemporary moment, you have this legalization of cannabis, and you have predominantly white communities making a lot of money, this new industry that's opening up. And at the same time, you have people of color in jail for possession of marijuana, still in jail. And there isn't a discussion of that connection in a mainstream way. And so when you think about how do you interrupt these things, I think a big piece of it is also understanding history, understanding how these narratives have come into our minds, have come into our media, and to be really discerning about the history that you're learning and the questions that you're asking, especially if they're telling one story about one community. That is like a signal that there are other stories I need to look at. I need some counter stories. I need to hear some other experiences, because nobody has one story. And systemic racism gets perpetuated by reinforcing single stories and single deficit stories. Yeah, thank you. I didn't have a graceful ending, sorry.
Okay. I think we're going to talk about the RIR protocol. So is that, who's doing that?
I am, and I wanted to make sure, Rosina, were you going to talk about curriculum a little bit? That was the last thing on the other slide. Did you want to talk about that?
Oh, yeah, I can. I thought I was on the next one. I apologize.
No worries.
Right. So when you're looking at, to talk about systemic racism, we're also looking at the type of curriculum that's introduced into our schools, right? So if we're looking at the type of authors that we read, so to give example of your English class, and you're reading classic novelists, right? Catcher in the Rye, you're reading all of these other novelists. And when you actually look at the books that are considered American classics, they tend to be all older white men, right? And then they tend to be the authors. And so who created and said these were classics, and why are there not representations of other authors when we do our curriculum? And so we talk about this for different schools, districts, because representation for other populations is incredibly important, right? When you learn about yourself and when you can see yourself being presented in curriculum, you have a better chance of seeing yourself in a positive form, right? And a lot of times we don't show other cultures and other races in positive form. I remember growing up and I went to school in California, and I'm Muslim, and I learned about Islam in 7th grade. And it was a very tiny portion in my history book, and I was asked about it in class because I was the only person who was Muslim in that class. And my teacher put me on the spot and asked me to tell the class about Islam. And so, but we weren't represented positively in that light. And even now, we're not represented positively in the news and the media. And so when you have that representation, that is systemic racism, right? We're not represented in a positive light, and it doesn't seem like there's any accolades or anything to talk about. So when we talk about Black history, you read about slavery is one of the first things you learn about, Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks. You never learn about the amazing inventions of Black inventors. You never learn about what the Black community has provided to the world, right? And it's really rare unless you have a teacher that really goes into that type of stuff, or if you take African American history, or you take a very specific class, maybe in college. And when you do this type of stuff, people of color not represented positively, and that impacts students who are trying to really benefit from that classroom. So if you're not able to see yourself represented in books and literature, or if you are represented, but you're not represented in a positive way, what does that say? And I'll even go a step further for special ed. Like, I was a special ed teacher. You rarely see special ed looked at positively in curriculum. Mm-hmm. And I taught for so many years. And when I started teaching, I don't want to give away to my school district, but I didn't even have curriculum for my moderate to severe students. I had to beg and plead for it. And so that's a form of systemic, it's not equitable, right? Like, those practices are not equitable for us. And so when we look at our curriculum and we look at what are we teaching in our classes and all of these different things, we have to really look at it from a lens of equity. We have to have people who there need to be representation of all the people and a sense of diversity for everybody in the school system.
Yeah, thank you. And just I'll add on that as we move on to the next slide for the protocol, is that there's a great book, several books that an author, James Lowen, wrote, and it was called The Lies My Teacher Taught Me. And basically he deconstructs the top textbooks in the country at that time for all the lies that are taught, that we teach knowingly, even though there's primary sources that contradict. And when you ask why, which is brings us to the protocol, when you ask why do we continue to teach lies when we know that this isn't the way that it truly unfolded, the only answer is systemic racism. It keeps a narrative, it keeps people in line, and it keeps some people believing that they're superior and other people's feeling inferior to each other. So it keeps the status quo. And so we're always challenging, you know, we talk about a broken system and we're seeing that a lot, but I wonder if the system is broken or is it that the system is doing exactly what it's designed to do? Which means that we have to ask some hard questions. And so that brings us to the protocol. We're just introducing this. This is protocol that students at Saratoga High School and Los Gatos have done. We've worked with this in the community, but the idea is in this time that we're in now and always, we have to start putting difficult conversations on the table. And one way to do it is through this tool where we call it compassionate dialogue. And the idea is if we're going to have hard conversations, we can't come at it with, you know, accusing people or threatening or all the things, or from anger or a place of where we can't be productive. And so protocol calls first for us to recognize what we're feeling inside and what is our belief about it. So if I understand that this is triggered, I know for sure that the George Floyd, his murder has triggered anger and a level of rage in me that I haven't experienced before. And I know that with the work I do, that I cannot be productive if I can't get past those feelings. And so in me recognizing what's triggered and letting that energy flow so that I can get to a zone of productivity, then I'm able to interrupt in a way that doesn't mean that I'm screaming and yelling, that I actually get to ask questions. And so the interrupt calls for us to stop what's happening, to hold people accountable. So it looked like for me this last weekend, running into someone that I know who had a MAGA hat on, and for 5 minutes dealing with that emotional thing inside of me that was happening, and recognizing that there was anger, there was fear, there was that, and then realizing that I must interrupt. But how I interrupted was from a place of compassion, because once I let that go, I was able to just ask the question, what does that mean to you? And in asking that question, it interrupted the message, and it allowed us to have about a 30-minute conversation about what this meant to him, which then translated to what it meant to me as a Black woman living in this community. And it was a powerful conversation. I wasn't trying to change his mind about his hat. I just wanted him to understand that there's another perspective. And so this idea of the protocol allows us to engage in places that we may not be able to do through inquiry and through compassion. And then repair is a step that happens after. The repair is something that we don't always get to, because sometimes after an interaction like that, we may avoid that person. But the repair says, what do you do the next time you come into contact with this person to actually cycle back around and deepen the relationship, to figure out if there is a relationship that can be salvaged, and to talk more to get to a greater understanding. And so sometimes the repair is that you just have to agree to disagree, but it allows us to still engage with each other. And when we think about the spaces that we're all in right now, when we're talking about education, we can't just disengage with everybody because they don't share our beliefs. So how do we engage in a way that's authentic for us and authentic for each other, and also helps us get to some type of solution together? So that's just a very quick down and dirty overview of the protocol.
Okay, before he reads the next question, I just want you to know that the next question has come up in our community a lot. So as we go to it, I know there might be a lot of students out there, parents that are listening to the response to this, because we all want to know how to deal with it.
Okay, student question number 3. Why is it okay for some Black people to say certain words, like the N-word, and not other people? How should a student interrupt derogatory labels on campus?
Well, that's a heavy one, isn't it? And often I get the question, what are the real rules about the N-word? I think I have to share personally. The N-word for me is an ugly racial slur, obviously. And for me, I can't use a word that has been historically the banner word of white racism. It's disparaging, it spews hatred. And so for me, that word doesn't come up in my vocabulary. However, many within the Black community have defended the use of the term by Black people, they're reclaiming and reassigning the word to be used as a term of endearment within a group that has relationship. It's taking the power of the word back, and it's used again within those relationships. I had a conversation the other day with a group of African Americans who, and I asked them, I said, you know, tell me about the use of this word. And they said a few things. Non-Blacks shouldn't use the word at all because the history and the relationship and the understanding is not there. And if you don't live with the discrimination and danger of being Black, you don't have the right to say the N-word. I thought that was pretty powerful that one of the people shared. And then it was interesting as I was having this conversation that several said, and when I say the N-word, I say at the end and not the ER, because the ER is the historic, ugly slur that strips away the humanity of African Americans. And so you will never hear me say the at the end of the word. So I know that's an ongoing debate. I certainly have heard the word many times. We see it in movies, and we see it as a casual, almost punctuation sometimes to words. And for me, it pierces me every time I hear it. But I do understand the perspective of young people who say, I've reclaimed this word. I've taken the power away from them and bringing it to my culture.
You know, and Donna, my experience is very similar to yours as far as it is not a word I use. I've consistently been this way. I'm in my 50s now, but when I started teaching in my early 20s, it was just not a word that ever sat with me, right? Because it's so derogatory, it's so negative, and it's painful for me. So when I taught in juvenile court and community schools, and I'm teaching mostly brown Latino kids and Black kids who have been expelled from public school, and they use this word all the time, and I'm struggling. And so you know, I went to a place there as well of inquiry. It's like, what does this word mean to you? Because for me, when I hear it, and I don't want to be that teacher, because obviously public school didn't work for you because you're with me now. So I don't want to be that teacher that says, you know, you're getting a referral because you said this word and we don't allow this word. And they, you know, a lot of them were involved in gangs. But they really talked to me about survival. And it was something that from my growing up, my experience, that I never really had to think about. And they talked about how they had to appear a certain way. So it wasn't only the use of the N-word, but it was them showing up sagging. It was them showing up with their hats a certain way, with the chains and the colors and all that. And, you know, we had all these rules, like you couldn't sag, you can't wear a hat, you can't wear a hoodie. And they're like, but I have to get to school. I have to go through 3 communities to get to this site. And for me to be safe, I got to look hard. I got to do this. And so we had to come to this understanding about who they have to be to survive and who they could be in a safe space. And it was amazing when they were given when we finally created a space that was safe for them to be, where they didn't have to pump up themselves and be hard, that they let it go, you know? And so, and when I think, I mean, I don't know the intricacies of the community to whom we're speaking. I mean, I've been at the schools and I've worked with your district, but it's relatively definitely affluent compared to the areas I was teaching in. And so what my thing is, it's so pop culture now that I wonder if people really understand the impact, and if they had more narrative, would they still use it? And again, I'm you know, I still go to that place when we talk about, and I'll address that, how students should interrupt. You have to first figure out what it means to you. And you have to figure out what issue. I can talk to it because I know why it offends me, but I can't tell you just not to say it. or how to interrupt it if you haven't figured out for yourself what it means to you. Like, what is your need to use it? Is it pop culture? Is it cool? Does it not have the same meaning? And if it doesn't, talk to people with whom it does, and have an opportunity. This is contact theory, that we get empathy. We develop empathy when we associate with people who are different from us, who bring different perspectives. And so if someone you love is highly offended by something you say, would you continue to say it? And so how do we personalize that too? So, interrupting, I think it's hard, but I think that it comes down to climate and culture, about students, what kind of climate and culture do you want to create? And are you willing to push against it to say, you know what, we have an opportunity now to address a wound that has been on our shoulders for years. And are we going to be part of perpetuating it? Or are we going to be part of healing it?
Okay, thank you.
Next question, what does allyship from non-Black people of color look like? What is the role for white folks? How can we help further the movement while still amplifying Black voices? BIPOC, for example.
Kelly, I think this is you.
Yeah, and I wasn't sure if Rosina was going to answer.
I was waiting for you to go first. You can go ahead.
Well, I'll speak to, what does it look like for white folks, and then I can speak for myself and a lot of the districts that we support. We are working with white teachers and white administrators, and the conversations, I think, start, as Nancy said, with that intense personal reflection. What is your connection to this issue? What part do you play in it? And I think the biggest thing is to realize there isn't a neutral place. You're not outside of what is happening. And so we use the imagery of, is it Beverly Tatum with the walkway?
Yeah.
Like the moving walkway? This idea that systemic racism is moving, and if we don't challenge it, we just are moving right along with it. But we're not off of it. And so I think for me, this is a huge moment of that, recognize it happening. I'm seeing people have conversations about their whiteness. I think white fragility, you can't even order it right now on, it's a beautiful moment of a mass understanding for white people that you're not outside of this issue. I think for me, when I think about what is the next step, is the interrupt. How does this translate past my own understanding of something? Because digging into that personal work is deep, and there can be resistance to it, and there can be fear about how do I engage, and shutting down, and questions of privilege and fragility, and all those things come up. And so I think that the understanding of where you are in yourself, and in the interruption piece, I feel like it is a fine line between being mindful about what's your own work to do and being willing to take risks to engage, and knowing that you may not say the right thing, but you have to say something. And there's a lot of work you can do on your own to prepare yourself to be in the spaces where you're going to act. And I think it's important, the second part of the question, help further the movement, still amplifying Black voices. I think, one of the things about systemic racism and white privilege is the centering of white perspective. And that can get replicated even if you feel like you're a white activist trying to support anti-racist work, because it is such a well-worn path. So I think it's really important to be aware and discerning about, is your engagement trying to run what is happening, or is your engagement actually supporting the needs of the people that are being directly impacted? And always asking yourself those questions. But I think it's moving through shame, it's moving through guilt, it's moving through fear. And I think it is important to have other white people to talk to about those things, so that when you show up in interracial spaces, you've done some of your own work. Because one thing that I think we see when we're doing this work sometimes is, let's say there's a racist incident and we're talking about it for the first time, and the people of color in the room are ready to, like, let's address it. We have some children, we need to make sure they're all right. And the white people in the room are figuring it out for the first time. and it becomes a frustrating space. And so the interracial work has to happen, but I think some of that work needs to be done in white spaces where you can work out your growing awareness together, educating yourself through history and through the study of Black voices, other voices of color, so that when you show up in those spaces, you're ready to do the work. And I feel like that is an ongoing cycle, because you may show up in that space and you may realize you've got to go back and do some more work internally and learn some more things and then show up again. And so we talk about this movement through this personal, interpersonal, systemic flow. And so what's the personal work that I have to do, which is wonderful, but doesn't mean anything unless it bumps up against the real world. So at some point I have to get interpersonal and engaged. And then the next step is to challenge those systems. And if I find that the system is too overwhelming, then maybe I back up and I have a conversation. And if I don't know how to do that, then I back up and I do my own work. And it means that there's always some place to work. You don't ever get to not be working, but there are different places and different levels to be engaging based on where you're at and what you're learning.
Okay, thank you.
I loved all of that. So I'm just going to add on from my point of view. As a person of color, we also need to do a lot of work, because colorism is rampant, I think, in every culture, even my own culture. As I said, I'm Pakistani Indian. I have very vivid memories of being very young and my aunts trying to put Fair and Lovely on me to make me lighter because I was considered too dark. So this is something that's embedded in, I think, a lot of cultures. And, you know, the darker you are, the less attractive you are, or whatever it is. And I think this is dialogue that we need to have and continue to have with members of our family, with the members of our extended family. In the past couple of weeks, I've spoken to my parents. My parents are amazing people, and they believe that the world is your community as a whole and it's your family. But they say, make biased comments or have microaggressions that I need to say, you can't say that, because that's a microaggression to another, and it's not okay for that to be said. And so I think it's really working it out, even with your own family, and addressing your biases and your understanding of something to realize why you have them, and then what created them, and then what you can do about them, right? Just because we have implicit biases doesn't mean that we have to be okay with carrying them. It's not oh, well, I have it and now I'm going to keep it. It's, I have it and I can change it. And so what does that look like? And like Kelly said, that means educating yourself. That means doing research. That means understanding, but also accepting it, right? The world is the world. Like, we want to make sure that we're going through it by acquiring more knowledge. And the more knowledge you gain, you can change your mind on certain topics that you maybe didn't have before. Maybe your family views differently than you. That's okay, right? To become an ally means to become an ally for everybody. So whether it's people of color, whether it's gay and lesbian, whether it is special ed, whether it's EL, allyship is allyship, right? If we don't help each other out and stand up for each other, there's no interest conversion within our work, then we're all going to we're not going to make it, right? And I'll give the example of when the Muslim ban went into effect. A lot of Muslim people were struck by this ban, and we all banded together to try to stop it, but we needed other people to help us. And when the community rallied for us, that's when change happened. And that's what we're here for. We're here to help make change. Just because I'm not Black does not mean this does not impact me. It impacts my community. It impacts my sisters and my brothers who are Black. And for that, I need to stand up and rise up, and I need to learn what I need to do so that I can support them in their time of need. So when my time of need comes, I can get the same support back, right? We're here for each other. We are a community. We work together. It's like if we had brothers and sisters, these are our extended family members, and we have to do what's right for the world.
Okay, so we are very close to running into our hour, and we have 3 questions to go. So I'm going to ask the panelists, are you okay with staying for just a bit longer, and maybe keep your answers very short, as much as possible?
Okay, the next question. How does the model minority myth drive a wedge between minority groups? How can we challenge the lack myth that uplifting the Black community equals repressing other minority communities?
You know, this could be a whole discussion in and of itself. And, but I think ultimately, you know, when we hear about the model minority myth, you know, people always say, well, what are you complaining about because it's positive, you know, but any kind of singular narrative about anyone is dangerous. And we know from experience that kids who would fall into this realm here feel the pressure of needing to be perfect and not having the space to be kids or to pursue divergent interests that may not be what's considered the norm. And so this idea that anything that says that, you know, you're perfect by doing this is going to be damaging. And so, and when you're up against this, when a myth, and you think about the divisiveness of a myth that says that, you know, you're a perfect American, and then anyone else who doesn't fit that is imperfect. And this notion that that there's not enough for everybody to thrive, and that what we need to start thinking about is how do we expand our definition of what it means? Well, how do we expand our definition of what it means to even be American? So that when we think of the all-American boy or all-American girl, we don't come up with one image that all of us can come up with first, right? And so it's really about understanding that when that singular stories about anybody are harmful, and that usually these stories, again, when I go back to systemic racism, are really tools of divisiveness to keep us separate from each other. It keeps me in competition with my Asian brothers and sisters, thinking that you have it too easy, you have this, all those things that are not true, but because I'm having a divergent experience, that there's got to be someone to take it out on. And so we really have to understand that there is room and there is space. We had a district, and I'm sorry, Carrie, I know you said short, but I think this is an important,
It's okay.
Important piece. We had a district that we were doing work, and what we found was that the kids who were being placed into 9th grade honors were predominantly white kids, even though it was a very diverse district. And we talked to the leadership, we did this work around equity, and we said, we need to open that up. And it was ironic, but the families and the teachers actually fought against opening it up to all students. And so the district made a choice to say that, you know what, since we can't decide on how to open it up and make it more accessible, we will have every 9th grade English class be an honors class. So every kid gets it. And the impact of that was significant. It was significant. And while there were still students who weren't as successful, more achieved than didn't. And that's exactly where the problem is. If I have a strong belief that you don't believe in this, belong in this space, I will ensure that you don't belong there, and I will ensure that you fail, whether it's implicitly or explicitly. And so we have to rethink how we do these systems.
Okay.
Moving on to student question 6. Moving forward, what are appropriate ways to talk about race within our schools?
You know, I'll direct some of my comments to leaders in schools and then teachers and students as well. I think if you are approaching the discussion around race with a desire to grow, heal, I don't think you can go wrong. I would say to leaders, step out into the messiness. As leaders and teachers, don't be paralyzed by fear. You cannot deliver the concise strategic plan on how you're going to get to the other side, but step out there and not be paralyzed by fear. Invite people to a place too. In our school, a couple of weeks ago, we pulled together and invited the community to share their pain in this moment. There was no other focus other than coming together as a community. And we had to do it via Zoom, but it worked. Just to hear people's pain and their experiences, let the narratives be told. And I would say also to leaders, create ongoing forums where there's an opportunity to listen with your ears and your heart about the culture of your schools and the incidences of racism that have occurred under your watch. And that's hard, but let those stories and those narratives come out because you'll grow. Commit to the development of intentional plans, forums, book clubs, guest speakers, individual cultural competency kinds of things so people can learn more about themselves, their viewpoints. Provide guidance around language. You guys have a great partner in Rosina and Kelly and Nancy to provide teachers language to use in the classroom when they hear biases. I don't know how to respond to that. What do I do? How do I capture the moment? What's the language? How do I understand and share microaggressions and point them out to students? Acknowledge sometimes leaders, particularly white leaders, lack knowledge and are ignorant of the struggle, the history of the struggle. Well, let others educate you. And then I think that in the conversations, based on what you learn, I think there needs to be conversations where you call out behaviors that are antithetical to the honoring of the dignity of students. And if it's happening, call it out. And probably that's not something in a big forum, but certainly you want to be able to call out those behaviors and expect some community standards. And then another couple of practical things to help with the conversations. Reprioritize your budgets. Work like this costs something. And so look at your budgets and enhance your budgets if you already have a budget around this kind of work, so that you can allocate dollars to deal with race-related culture in your school. And these things take courage. And here's why I think it takes courage to implement some of these things, because some folks may decide to take the exit ramp. When you get serious about this Black Lives Matter and racial reconciliation stuff, some people, it's not for them, and they take you might lose some partnerships, and that's the reality. And you'll ostracize and offend, and you'll rock the boat a little bit. But I think it's worth it to engage in the conversations, and starting next month is not good enough. Start now, start tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, I think this is our last question.
Yes. What are longer term action items we can do, i.e. continuously supporting local Black-led organizations, petitioning, let your pocketbook do the talking, book studies, literature circles, discussions with friends and family, etc.?
So there are lots of things that we can do long-term to make long-term action items. But when you think about all of the things that you can do, sometimes it gets really overwhelming. And especially if you're if you have this, I don't want to say you're new to this, but you're, dipping your toe in the water of potentially a mind shift. So some of the things that you can start to do, like Kelly had mentioned earlier, is research on your own. Really, the internet has some great resources out there. Start reading books. We at EPIC do book club. We do a Facebook book club. We do book club through Zoom. We have discussions. Gather some friends up. You can start your own book club. Maybe the teachers at your school site can support this. But have talking points when you're talking to your friends. If you have questions, ask questions. I always tell people, one of the lines that I've been using the past week is, I'm imperfectly showing up because I'm not sure how to perfectly show up, but I know that I need to show up. And so I'm completely imperfect, and I'm okay with that, because I feel like even as an equity trainer, I'm still learning. And I don't think I'll ever stop learning. And so that is part of my job as a human being. So I'll read, I'll connect, I'll ask questions, I'll attend things that make me uncomfortable, and I think that's a big one, because a lot of times we won't do things because we're fear we won't get accepted, fear that they'll look at us as part of the problem. And this really isn't Black versus white, right? If you're white, this isn't a hit on you're not good, you're part of the problem. It's none of that, right? We are really in this to educate and to arm ourselves with knowledge so that we can really change the world for the future generations. You guys are going to get out there. You guys are going to change the world in such an amazing way. I recently, over the weekend, went to a student-led march in Milpitas, and it was completely run by the students. They spoke, they did amazing work, and the kids, you guys are going to change the world. I firmly believe that. And you'll do that by doing this type of stuff. And I actually feel like the biggest challenge you might have is the discussion with your friends and family, because that's where the real tough job lies, is really having a discussion with the family and the people that raised us with some of the beliefs that we have. And I know this on a personal level, like talking to my parents and really saying and calling them out for stuff is very, very difficult for me. But I know that I need to do that. And I need to do that as a community as a whole. I need to say that this is not okay, that this language, and you know, we do argue, my parents and I, we get into it sometimes, but I know that this is something that I need to say. I need to interrupt them just so we can have a conversation about that. But a lot of times the other stuff that I do is so easy compared to talking to my own family. That's why people kind of dread Thanksgiving and Christmas when we come back, right? Because that's where the challenging conversations happen. But that's what you need to do. Arm yourself with the information that you have and really understand what Nancy had said. You may not change someone's mind, but if you can plant a seed of thought so that someone can just think a little differently, that's great, right? We train constantly. I never get somebody that's like, oh my God, you've changed my mind. I'm no longer going to be like this. It never happens. But if I can get somebody to engage in compassionate dialogue with me and really talk with me about something, I know that there's hope. And that's what we're looking for, is hope in the world and that conversation. So don't shut anybody down. I don't believe this. I can't believe you're like this. Engage in that compassionate dialogue and understand their perspective so that you can share your perspective.
Okay. So the last slide, I'm not sure, questions from the audience. I hear that there's a lot of stuff going on the Google Doc, and a lot of it's directed to things that are happening locally. And I know that the district's going to address all those things, and he will speak to that. But Mr. Torrens, is there anything that you feel pressing that we can ask the panelists quickly?
Well, there are lots of questions. I think just to clarify that some folks were expecting to get specific answers to their specific site. And as we mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, this was more to teach and inform the students. I have time. I'll throw one question out from the panel. And that question is specifically, how can we students react when we witness racism at school? That's the first part. The second part is, how can we explain to the person that what they said or did is racist in a way that makes sense to them without starting a conflict?
I'll jump in, and then please. So I think it's a good question, and I think it's very appropriate for where you are. But if your goal is not to start a conflict, then you may never step in, because there's no guarantee that there will not be conflict at the end of the interruption. And so I think that the questions you have to ask yourself is, again, as we said earlier, it's at checking in with what you value. So if this is super, super important to you, then we can't be focused on whether or not someone's not going to like me or there's going to be a conflict. We have to be focused on interrupting the behavior so that we can change the climate and culture on our site. And when you come from that place, I think that you become less concerned about the outcome. And so my thing is, you see it happening on your campus, and sometimes proximity, having somebody next to you, you have to really think about safety too. So are you safe? And I mean real safe, which is different than discomfort. If you're uncomfortable, you got to lean into that. But if you're actually physically unsafe, then there's got to be other avenues. But what I find in my examples is that that there is power in numbers, and the more vocal that you become and the more that you gather people around you. And when as kids, like, you start having these conversations, so you really become clear on who your allies are, who's supporting you, who also believes this, then you can do it together. Because we have been silent, that I believe it's a minority voice. I think that the hate is a minority voice, but it's the loudest voice. And so how do we become louder than the hate?
And I think to a certain degree, sometimes it's an art to discern how to respond. Obviously, if it's overt racism, that's one thing. Sometimes there are racist things that are shared that are some people might think are compliments. And so you have to make visible for people what is invisible based on what they shared or said or did. And so being able to convey what was offensive and helping people understand that, practicing even how to share certain things. There are certain things that are said over and over again that you develop your script in your head and you help to educate. Because I believe sometimes sometimes people say, well, I didn't intend to offend you. And it really isn't about intentionality. It's about the impact that comment or that action was. It's the impact of it, not whether there was intentionality. And so helping people understand that is critical.
I just wanted to add to one of the things when we talk about the interrupting the protocol is as much as you can separating the doer from the deed. So if I come at you as you've done this thing, so you are this, I'm not gonna hear anything that you're saying. I'm gonna shut right down. So one just strategy is, can you name the behavior? Can you name the offense? Can you name the impact instead of naming what the person is? Because if you've named what I am, there's nowhere for us to go. There's nowhere to have dialogue. And it's still gonna be uncomfortable because we're not used to, we don't have a collective culture where we're comfortable engaging and questioning each other. So somebody may still take offense to what you're saying or get defensive. And part of it is, how do you stay right there with them? I'm not condemning you. I'm actually right here with you, but we also need to talk about this. And affirming their humanity at the same time you're challenging their behavior.
Okay. So there's resources, and the webinar is recorded, and we're going to post it on the school website, SHS TV perhaps. So look for an announcement next week if you're here and you want to share it with somebody. Again, reminder that there's a lot of work to be done, and we clearly know that. We would especially like to thank Donna, Rosina, Nancy, and Kelly for sharing their personal stories with us tonight, their wisdom, their knowledge, their insight. As we strive to make our towns and our schools safer and even more responsive to the needs of students, we look forward to listening to the students at our schools, listening to your stories, your ideas, your dreams. We also commit to you that we will act. We seek that partnerships with families and civic leaders, as well as we tackle the pervasiveness that is racism.
It is with a sense of urgency that we in the Los Gatos-Saratoga High School District commence anew the discussions around race. As outlined by our superintendent, Dr. Grove, we cannot solve this issue overnight, but we will take thoughtful short-term and long-term actions. To take the lead, we will establish a district community-level advisory group that will include community partners as well as site-specific advisory groups to help guide this work over the long term. As an immediate action and as a concrete step toward providing the learning environment our students deserve, we will this summer conduct a thorough review of our policies and procedures related to discrimination to ensure that we offer explicit expectations for appropriate behavior and how we will respond if someone violates these expectations. These expectations, policies, and procedures will be in place before students return to school in August and will be shared and highlighted with all students, staff, and families as we return to school. To our students, we wish each a restful summer and hope that you will join us when we reach out, that you will share your stories, that you will be kind to one another, that you will implement the recognize, interrupt, and repair protocol shared tonight, and that you will continue to become the upstanders of your generation. Again, we thank our panelists for their generous offering of their time and expertise. Thank you for attending, and we look forward to seeing you all in person soon again. Good night.
Yeah.